For decades, Jamaica had a reputation for being one of the most difficult cases in the International Monetary Fund's history. Time and time again, the country would fall into economic crisis. Debt would pile up, inflation would flare, and once again, the IMF would step in with a new program. By the early 2010s, Jamaica's debt-to-GDP ratio had risen to over 140%, one of the highest in the world, and growth had been stagnant for years. The island was stuck in a cycle of borrowing, crisis, and more borrowing. Economists often spoke of Jamaica as a cautionary tale rather than a success story. And yet, fast forward to today, and you will hear the IMF itself pointing to Jamaica at almost every opportunity. Whenever the fund wants to defend the effectiveness of its programs, Jamaica is the example that comes up. Whenever its officials give speeches about fiscal discipline or resilience to shocks, Jamaica is mentioned. Whenever they need to convince other countries to stick with tough reforms, Jamaica's story is put forward as proof that it can work. In fact, the turnaround has been so dramatic that the IMF did more than just praise Jamaica from afar. In 2024, the IMF actually hired Jamaica's sitting finance minister, Nigel Clark, bringing him in as a deputy managing director. It is hard to imagine a stronger symbol of just how much the IMF loves Jamaica's recent record. To understand why the IMF has embraced Jamaica so tightly, we have to go back to the reforms of the last decade. In 2013, Jamaica entered another IMF program, but this one was different. The government committed to strict fiscal targets, supported by new laws designed to keep spending under control. A fiscal responsibility framework was put in place, requiring the government to steadily reduce the debt burden over time. At the same time, tax reforms were introduced to improve revenue collection, and wage bill controls were established to limit runaway public spending. Another critical step was giving the Bank of Jamaica more independence. The central bank was gradually freed from political influence, with a mandate to focus on price stability. Over time, this independence helped anchor inflation expectations, keeping price growth in check and bringing credibility to monetary policy. For a country that had long struggled with bouts of high inflation, this was a major shift. Institutional innovations also played a key role. The Economic Program Oversight Committee, known as EPOC, was set up as a watchdog body. It brought together private sector representatives, unions, and civil society groups to monitor the government's progress under the IMF program. This created a sense of shared ownership and transparency that had often been missing in earlier reform efforts. Instead of IMF targets being negotiated behind closed doors, they were being tracked openly with monthly updates shared with the public. That helped build trust that the reforms were serious and not just another paper exercise. The results were striking. Within a decade, Jamaica slashed its debt burden dramatically, cutting the ratio almost in half. Foreign reserves were rebuilt, fiscal deficits narrowed, and investor confidence improved. Credit rating agencies upgraded Jamaica, and the country was able to access international markets on more favorable terms. Inflation was brought under better control, and the currency stabilized. These were exactly the kinds of outcomes the IMF had been trying to promote for years. It is no wonder then that the IMF began holding up Jamaica as its model student. In press releases, Jamaica was described as an example of fiscal discipline. In speeches, senior IMF officials would highlight Jamaica as proof that strict reform programs, even when painful, could produce results. In IMF publications, Jamaica appeared again and again as a case study of successful adjustment. It became clear that Jamaica had moved from being a perennial problem case to being the poster child for what the IMF wanted to see. Part of what made Jamaica so useful to the IMF is that the reforms were sustained across political cycles. Governments changed, but the core policies were not abandoned. The fiscal rules stayed in place, the central bank's independence continued to strengthen, and debt reduction remained a top priority. This consistency is rare in IMF programs, where countries often start reforms only to backslide when politics shift or when the short-term pain becomes too great. Jamaica's ability to stick with the program, even when it was unpopular, gave the IMF a powerful narrative. Here was a country that actually delivered. That narrative became even more valuable in the 2020s when global institutions were under pressure. Critics of the IMF argued that its programs demanded too much austerity, hurt social spending, and failed to deliver growth. Against that backdrop, Jamaica's story was a counter-argument. The IMF could point to Jamaica and say, look, here's a country that took tough measures, stuck with them, and is now more stable and resilient. The fact that Jamaica was a small island state, vulnerable to external shocks and natural disasters, made the story even more compelling. If Jamaica could do it, why not others? The ultimate symbol of this special relationship came in 2024. Nigel Clark, Jamaica's finance minister since 2018, had been at the center of the country's reform effort. Under his watch, debt kept falling, fiscal discipline was maintained, and the IMF relationship remained strong. When the IMF announced that it was appointing Nigel Clark as a deputy managing director, it was clear that this was more than just a professional hire. It was a signal. By bringing Clark into its leadership, the IMF was embracing not only the man, but also the Jamaican model he represented. It was as if the fund was saying, this is exactly the kind of policymaker we want to showcase. Now, of course, Jamaica is not the only country that has had success with IMF programs. Countries like Chile, Peru, Poland, and Ireland have also been cited as positive examples in the past. They managed to use IMF support to stabilize their economies, implement reforms, and return to growth. But what makes Jamaica stand out is how visible and dramatic its turnaround has been, and how heavily the IMF leans on it in its messaging. While other success stories get mentioned occasionally, Jamaica is the one that appears again and again, especially in recent years. The sheer frequency with which Jamaica is invoked shows that the IMF sees it as uniquely valuable for its own narrative. But the story is not without complications. Critics point out that while Jamaica has achieved impressive macroeconomic results, the benefits for ordinary citizens have been less clear. Economic growth remains modest, and inequality continues to be a challenge. Public services have been under strain, and many Jamaicans feel that the sacrifices demanded by the IMF programs have not translated into significantly better living standards. In other words, the IMF focuses on debt and inflation metrics, but those are not the same as improvements in everyday life. This tension raises an important question. Is Jamaica's success mainly about optics, a convenient story for the IMF to tell, or is it a genuine transformation that is changing the country's long-term prospects? The answer may be a bit of both. On one hand, Jamaica has undeniably strengthened its fiscal position and built more resilient institutions. Those are real achievements. On the other hand, the social and growth challenges show that stability does not automatically translate to prosperity. What is clear, though, is that from the IMF's perspective, Jamaica is the ideal example. It shows that with discipline, transparency, and political commitment, a country can escape from the cycle of debt and crisis. It provides a counterweight to critics who say the IMF's approach never works. And now with Nigel Clark inside the IMF's top leadership, Jamaica's influence extends beyond its own borders, shaping the way the institution presents itself to the world. So why does the IMF love Jamaica so much? Because Jamaica gives it a story it badly needs. A story of success in a world where many programs are criticized. A story of credibility in the face of skepticism. A story of reforms that stuck, politics that cooperated, and results that can be measured. Whether Jamaica's people feel the full benefits of that success is another matter. But for the IMF, Jamaica is more than just a partner. It is the poster child, the favorite example, and even the source of its newest deputy managing director. That is why Jamaica occupies such a special place in the IMF's narrative, and why we can expect to keep hearing about it whenever the fund wants to prove that its model works.